Each year, we come together as a community to commemorate Kristallnacht, the night of the broken glass. And these last few years, since COVID, we've spent a good deal of that time focusing on what it means to be good neighbors and expressing our commitment to one another. This year, we are privileged to have the opportunity to hear the firsthand account of the Hess family, which was captured in the book Inseparable by Faris Cassell. And we are grateful to the Jewish Book Council for connecting us, certainly with Faris, but we already were aware that remarkably, or maybe not, I would say coincidentally, that Marion Hess, now Marion Lewin, was our neighbor just up the road in Friendship Heights, in fact, neighbor of many of our Washington Hebrew congregants. Tonight is a lesson for each of us in the importance of sharing our stories and ensuring that those stories become a part of our collective narrative so that we can ensure that we continue not only to be good neighbors, but to ensure that history does not repeat itself. So I'm going to introduce our speakers, certainly the author of this book, Faris Cassell, and Marion Lewin. I'm going to introduce Marion first, although Faris is going to speak first. You'll understand in a few moments. So Marion Lewin received her undergraduate and graduate education at Barnard College and Columbia University. Her professional career focused on health policy and healthcare economics. She has an incredibly diverse and rich resume of achievements and engagement in the community. It's remarkable. She was recognized for her lifetime achievements in leadership development and healthcare policy by the National Research Center for Women and Families. She was as well the director of the Center for Health Policy Research at the American Enterprise Institute and Deputy Director of the National Health Policy Forum at George Washington University. She began her career in health policy as a health legislative aide for the House Subcommittee on Health and the Environment. Ms. Lewin has held leadership positions on several boards, including Providence Hospital in Washington, D.C., the Primary Care Coalition of Montgomery County, and the Quality Health Foundation of the Eastern Shore. In recent years, Ms. Lewin has pursued her deep interest in theater and related arts. For several years, she co-chaired the Council of Theater J and served on the board of Roundhouse Theater in Bethesda and the Defiant Requiem Foundation. In the past few years, Marion Lewin's life has taken yet a new turn. She and her brother, Stephen Hess, are likely the only surviving twins of the Holocaust. Imprisoned at Westerbork and Bergen-Belsen, they were one of only 5 families out of tens of thousands there where everyone survived. In March 2021, a front-page article by the renowned Los Angeles Times journalist Steve Lopez featured the Hess family's remarkable Holocaust journey and survival that received wide attention. The article followed an op-ed piece Marion Lewin had written for the paper a year earlier on my childhood memories of the Holocaust in a world of COVID-19. The results were a book, Inseparable, by award-winning author Faris Cassell. From hardly saying a word about her background in years past, Marion Lewin is now dedicated to telling the story of her family, to remind people never to be indifferent when injustice and humanity hang in the balance and people forget or choose not to remember. The story would be powerful enough to share tonight as we observe Kristallnacht this weekend, but it takes on new significance because Marion and her family left Germany and went to Amsterdam to escape what they saw coming. That much more remarkable as we stand here tonight following the events of last night, and we know many of us saw the remarks by the King of the Netherlands, who said that we failed the Jewish people in World War II, and we failed them again last night. But we have this story that is told by Faris Cassell, who is the author of 2 nonfiction Holocaust books, most recently Inseparable, the Hess twins' Holocaust journey through Bergen-Belsen to America, which we will hear about tonight. Faris's first book, The Unanswered Letter, which I know many of us have read, won 2 national awards, including a 2020 Jewish Book Award. She earned her master's degree in journalism from the University of Oregon and graduated from Mount Holyoke College. She lives in Eugene, Oregon. We are so honored to have both Faris Cassell and Marion Lewin here with us tonight. We will hear first from Faris about the book itself, and then Marion will share some of the personal aspects. We'll share a little bit during the service, but we also know that many of you will want to have a chance to engage in conversation. So following our service, we'll have an opportunity for us to get a little bit up close and personal, be able to ask questions. So as you're listening, think about those questions you might want to pose. Again, we are honored to have both Faris Cassell and Marion Lewin with us this evening.
I'm grateful to be here for the 86th anniversary on the eve of Kristallnacht, the 2-day state-sponsored violent pogrom that raged through the German Reich, which then included Germany and Austria. In that unprovoked, is this okay? Better. Okay, sorry. In that unprovoked attack, mobs set fire to almost all the synagogues in the Reich and the prayer houses. Non-Jews commandeered Jewish homes, sometimes pushing families out the windows. Many Jews were deported. Hundreds died, and non-Jews smashed thousands of Jewish businesses, leaving the streets littered with glittering shards of glass, leading to the name Kristallnacht, Night of Crystal. That brutal night signaled the beginning of what would become the Holocaust. We're here on this auspicious night to talk about that dark time in Jewish history and about one family's Holocaust experience. I've been asked, how did I learn about this story? And why was I drawn to this family's particular Holocaust story? This is, as you've heard, my second nonfiction book about the Holocaust. Both came to me by chance. The first began when my husband, a doctor, brought home a letter given to him by a patient whose family had received it in 1939. In it, a desperate Viennese Jewish family writing to strangers in America begged for help to escape Nazi terror. That book follows my journey to discover the different paths through the Holocaust of the 5 members of that family. Inseparable explores the Holocaust experience of the courageous German Jewish family of 4, Karl and Ilse Hess, and their twin children, Marion and Stephen. In the spring of 2021, I thought I was finished writing about and living with stories of that dark time. Coincidentally, however, that spring, Marion, as you've heard, wrote an op-ed for the Los Angeles Times, expressing admiration for COVID workers for their resilience and their selflessness, risking their lives at times to help those in need. They reminded her, she wrote, of Jews imprisoned in the concentration camp Bergen-Belsen, who courageously helped each other as they could to survive. Marion knew about those prisoners, about the barbed wire and huge piles of dead bodies strewn around that camp because she and her family were survivors of that camp. The Times reporter then wrote a story about the Hess family, which came to the attention of my publisher, who asked if I would be interested in writing about this family. I found their story just amazing. I spoke to Marion and Stephen in their 80s, both of them bright and active in their communities on the East Coast. They agreed to support my efforts to write their story. As a journalist, I would have preferred meeting Marion and Steve in person, but that wasn't possible. Some airlines that year declared bankruptcy. No one was traveling. even if I'd dared. The twins were in their 80s. They lived in different cities on the East Coast. I live in Oregon. A visit from me would have been risky for them and for me. But they were wonderful, answering my hundreds of questions by Zoom, email, and phone. They shared with me the memoir of their Holocaust experience that their father wrote shortly after World War II. I found interviews that the twins' mother, Ilse, had given, most importantly, as testimony for the Holocaust Museum here in D.C. And so the Hess family's story unfolded for me in their own voices, but in my home, in my study, where I laughed, worried, worked long hours into the night, and sometimes cried as they told me what their family had endured. Their story begins with newlyweds, Carl and Ilse. He, a highly successful sales representative of United Silk, a multinational textile company. She, the beautiful young daughter of a prominent Jewish family. They had a happy, promising young married life until Nazi persecution of Jews intensified. Seeing the writing on the wall, the conditions for Jews would only deteriorate, the young couple decided to flee the mounting terror while that was still possible. Like Anne Frank's family, Carl and Ilse left Germany in 1936 for the supposed safety of Amsterdam in neutral Holland. Their plan was for Carl to leave first and begin the new job waiting for him. Ilse would follow with their belongings, including their valuable jewelry, a hedge against possible threats to their safety. But the Germans had strictly forbidden anyone, much less a Jew, to take valuables out of the country. Because of his job transfer with a German company, in 1936, Carl crossed the border with no problem. But Ilse faced the difficult, dangerous challenge of crossing the border by herself. She needed to obtain an exit visa, pack, and accompany her belongings. The Nazis' mantra then was that Jews must go, but their money stays. How she managed facing obstacles that could have led to her arrest is a revealing part of the family's long Holocaust journey. I feel it's important to note here that despite all the Nazi threats, many Jews remained hopeful and determined to make good lives for their families. Sometimes they found humor in that crazed, tumultuous time. To cross the border with their jewelry, beautiful 22-year-old Ilse, who always dressed respectably, bought high-heel shoes, fishnet stockings, a short skirt, and she wore heavy makeup. She simply pinned their jewelry to the black velvet lapels of her red jacket, and she crossed the border, hiding their jewelry in plain sight. She would later laugh. They thought I was a 10-mark hooker, and my diamonds were fake. Marks being German currency. 2 years later, 1938, the twins were born. But the family's peace vanished in one horrible day, May 10th, 1940. The family was trapped under Nazi oppression. Carl and Ilse did everything imaginable to escape, to hide, to keep their family safe. Yet, after several years under this menacing cloud, the Hess family was rounded up and transported to Westerbork, a transit camp, where Jews were imprisoned under harsh but survivable conditions, awaiting further deportation to extermination camps like Auschwitz and Sobibor. Anne Frank's family was also imprisoned in Westerbork during that time. At one point, Ilse arranged to give her extraordinarily valuable jewelry to the Nazis in exchange for keeping the family from deportation to those unknown places in the dreaded direction of the East. Remember that in those years, the concept of exterminating an entire people did not yet exist. The term Holocaust had not been invented. But Jews did know that train after train, cattle cars loaded with some 1,000 Jews per train, left Westerbork weekly, heading east, and everyone knew that those prisoners never returned. Time and again, the Hess family strove with what resources they had, from jewelry to their courage and resourcefulness, to save themselves. Ilse had gladly traded her jewelry for what turned out to be not the amnesty promised, but only a delay. But that reprieve proved life-saving. In 1943, the Hesses were deported to Bergen-Belsen, a labor camp, not an extermination camp. It was unlike any other Nazi concentration camp. It was established late in World War II when the Germans were losing ground. In Bergen-Belsen, the Germans imprisoned Jews who held passports from neutral countries. So those prisoners could be held as hostages to exchange for German soldiers captured by the Allies. Carl and Ilse were able to purchase forged Paraguayan passports, hoping they would be sent to this new camp. The Hess family was in fact deported to Belsen. While it had been intended to be a survivable camp, as war intensified and Russian troops advanced across Eastern Europe, the Germans began evacuating their extermination camps, beginning with those most in danger of being liberated by the Russians. Can anyone imagine why that would be? It would be to keep the world from learning their terrible secret. Remember, the world knew about Nazi persecution of Jews, but nothing about the Nazis' second war, the genocidal war against Jews. Belsen became a dumping ground for those prisoners. Many were diseased, starving, crammed into cattle cars, or force-marched to Bergen-Belsen, hideously overcrowded with minimal food, water, or sanitation. Belsen turned from just barely survivable to deadly. At least 50,000 Jews would lose their lives there. Through this hell, the Hess family struggled to help each other and others time and again. Their survival is a miracle. Now, you are fortunate to hear Marion tell us more about her family's experience surviving Nazi cruelty. I challenge you to consider as you listen, is there anything in this dark story that gives us reason for hope or that you find inspiring?
Well, let me move closer and begin by telling you how honored I feel being here tonight. When I moved to Washington, we had living with us a high school student from Padua, Italy. He didn't know a word of English, but he was very religious. And so I realized that I would have to find a synagogue because he would certainly want to go to a synagogue every Friday night, every holiday. We were pretty good at that as well, but he was quite religious. And so, but I had moved here recently as well, so I didn't know the lay of the land. But I took him here first. And he looked around, and in his very broken English, he says, "Is this a synagogue or a palace?" And I always remember he was so amazed. And he came here many times. And this is, of course, a legendary place of worship. And I feel very honored being here tonight. I was supposed to show you some slides. Oh. Okay. But I'm going to spend a few minutes less walking through the slides, because as I sat here tonight, I was so focused on Kristallnacht and all my memories and what my mother told me. They all came together, and it is quite a story. And so I just want to talk about what Kristallnacht meant in my family. Well, Kristallnacht was, of course, in November 1938. My parents and my twin brother and I were already in Amsterdam, and that, of course, was already another place where people felt that some horrible things would happen, and it was a time of great turmoil, of great anxiety, of tremendous fear. But my grandparents, my mother's side, my maternal grandparents, were still in Recklinghausen. And my grandfather was the head of the congregation, the head of the board. And so on Kristallnacht, November 1938, and so I kind of figured it out, he came to visit us when my twin brother and I, it was the only time that they got a permit to spend about 6 hours in Amsterdam visiting their new grandchildren. And so that was about in March. So here comes in November 1938. And my grandfather is head of the synagogue, a beautiful synagogue in Recklinghausen. And of course, he hears, the noise, the fire, the screaming, and he runs down to the synagogue to see what's happening. And of course, the synagogue is totally destroyed and the broken glass. And he tries to do what he can. Of course, he couldn't do very much. And he was arrested that night and beaten up. And that was in November 1938. And people, many people now feel that Kristallnacht was truly the beginning of the Holocaust and the final solution. And my grandfather was put into prison. And then, because the synagogue was destroyed, he made part of his home, they had a lovely home, as a place to worship. And so he took the 2 best rooms in the house and transferred the Torah there, whatever they could. They survived, and other people, of course, volunteered to replace documents and sacred objects as well. And so that's where the congregation was, in my grandparents' house. But then, of course, the Nazis felt that no Jews should have their own house, especially a big house. So 4 families moved into my parents' house, and it became a more crowded place. But my grandparents always welcomed them. And then the first Yom Kippur after Kristallnacht was held in my grandparents' home. And before the service started, now this is Yom Kippur, my grandfather gets a call from the local Nazi headquarters and says that everyone had to hand in their radios. Now, can you imagine the cruelty of worshiping Yom Kippur, and then everyone has to go to their houses and collect their radios so that nobody will be able to hear or have communications from the outside world. And that is what happened at that time, at the following Yom Kippur. And my grandfather had a heart attack right after that. And of course, I think his death can be attributed to all the stress of that time. And he was supposed to have been an amazing person. And then at the time of, my goodness, I don't have to run through his slides, but I feel this is such a touching story. So my grandfather passes away, and my mother was their only child, their precious only child. And it was a very close family. And my grandmother is sitting shiva, and she cannot believe that her daughter, her only daughter, her loving daughter, is not appearing for the shiva. Of course, at that time, because the Germans had already attacked Holland, there was no communication, no telegram arrived. There was no way of my mother even knowing that her father had passed away. And I tell you this story because, I retired 2 years before I really thought I would in the field of healthcare and health economics, because I wanted to just hang out with my mother. She was so remarkable, and I just didn't always want to look at my clock or, kind of feel that I was always rushing here and there. And we would talk about her life, and that was such a blessing that I had that chance. And she said that when she thinks of everything that she went through, this is still the saddest memory, that her mother, who she loved so much, was waiting to see her daughter at the time of my mother's father's death, and she never disappeared. I mean, she never was able to be there. And it was a sadness, really, that remained with my wonderful mother till the rest of her life. So that was kind of the aftermath of Kristallnacht. So let me show you these, if I can even look that high. Oh, all right. So these just put a face, I think, to the book that wonderful Faris Cassell wrote so beautifully. And she's a wonderful writer and a wonderful historian. And so there is my mother and father at their engagement in 1934, where people still felt that even though Hitler was already a threatening figure, that they felt he would be a passing phenomenon and they could still live happily in Germany. And then, of course, you see my mother with the twins. At that time, there weren't as many twins born, so we were kind of an oddity in the hospital where we were born in Amsterdam. And there is my Philly Hirschberg, the wonderful man I just told you about, and my grandmother, Funny, who was also an amazing woman. And that was, of course, the only time that they ever saw us. We were about 3 months old, and of course, a few months later, it was Kristallnacht. Okay, we can do the next slide. This is my father with my brother and I in still the time when you could be a child and laugh and be joyful. All right. So this was the costume that was in this newspaper, and that really kind of had such resonance because someone recognized that this Dutch costume came from a certain fishing village. That time, different parts of the country had different costumes. They all looked like Dutch costumes, basically, but they had different trimmings on embroidery. And when this article came out, someone in Los Angeles recognized that this came from Urk, a small fishing village, and that we discovered that our wonderful nanny came from there, and her children came from there, and that's one of the other things that's been so amazing, that history never stops revealing new things, because we didn't know any of this, of course, at the time, but there have been so many things in the last 5 or 6 years that have been revealed that have been so wonderful to fill in the story, the missing pieces of the puzzle. So that is now, there's an interesting story about this picture. Our nanny, who came from Urk and wore a native costume when she took care of us, she always wanted the twins to be dressed in native costumes. Now, we didn't walk around that way in Amsterdam every day. And so we sat for a famous photographer, and he took the picture. And this famous photographer, 3 days later, was assassinated by the Nazis, the ruling powers then in Holland, because it was discovered that he also was taking pictures for fraudulent passports to allow Jews to leave the country. And so that picture was taken, and the next week he was no longer living. He was a great hero himself. Okay. All right, well, this is Kristallnacht, and, you know, it was just an amazing happening, so extremely well organized. And I think the Nazis also felt at that time that they could get away with everything because the rest of the world wasn't paying attention or wasn't listening or wasn't able to act. And so this was clearly, you know, in the beginning, Hitler really didn't want, because that wasn't his first idea, to have a genocide and put a death sentence on every Jew. He hoped that Germany would be Juden rein, free of Jews, and be in other countries or leave Germany. And of course, you know that that wasn't able to happen because even countries like America had very strict visa laws, and people were not able to leave. And so I think he felt in some way that, well, people don't really care about the Jews, so we'll have to take care of them ourselves by murdering each and every one of them. So this was Westerbork, and that was a transit camp. Almost every Jew who was taken to the concentration camp first went to Westerbork. And in the beginning, you know, they had operas there and theaters there. You know, the Germans and the Nazis were very clever because they wanted to keep the Jews unexcited, you know, not to feel that all of a sudden their life was at stake. Of course it was, but they didn't realize it. So they wanted a certain normalcy. And so they allowed these activities to take place, but then, of course, they were very short-lived. Because, for example, in Westerbork, they were called the Tuesday trains. So every Tuesday, a train would come through the middle of Westerbork. And the night before, the list would be called out of the people who had to be on the train. And it was absolutely specific to the person. If the Nazis said we need 649 people on the train, it was 649. It was never 648 or never 650. And so, and I remember very well, even though I was young, you know, the wailing, the tragedy of all of a sudden people being called, and, you know, in the beginning, they really didn't know where they'd be taken to. Now, when my parents had shoes made for us before we were taken away, and they were heavy shoes that you could, you know, walk in muddy places. And there was first this thought that it would be like people went to farming villages and helped the local citizens there, and then they would return. But then, of course, when they realized people were put on trains and you never heard from them again, that it was really a one-way route, and you never heard from these people again. So, of course, it was very ominous. It was very tragic. And I remember it so well, this kind of pall that came over. I mean, it would be like someone calling out, 50 of you, and, they say you can take your little rucksack, and we'll meet at the door, but you have no idea at all what is going to befall you. And so it was from there that these trains took people to the concentration camps. Now, why did we survive? And I didn't know that until long after my parents passed away, because there were only 2 destinations from Westerbork for the first few years, which were Auschwitz and Sobibor. And in both of those camps, we would have not survived for one day. I mean, anyone who wasn't capable of slave labor was of no use. And I know there was Mengele at Auschwitz, but our life would have been over. And so it was really, it was luck. It was, how can you say that, to be lucky to go to Bergen-Belsen? That sounds very, very odd. But at least in Bergen-Belsen, in the beginning, you had a chance to survive. And why do we get to Bergen-Belsen? I only learned that about 10 years ago, that we actually had forged passports from Paraguay. Paraguay was neutral, and the Nazis kind of accepted those passports, and that is why we ended up in Bergen-Belsen, where the Jews who had these passports were thought of to be eventually traded for German soldiers behind enemy lines, that we would be like hostages, that they could trade us for soldiers that they wanted to save. By the way, my parents really, I only discovered that recently. So, I always ask my parents, how did we end up in Bergen-Belsen? And, they never really knew the answer. So this was Bergen-Belsen on the day, I think it was taken by the British when they liberated the camp. And of course, Anne Frank passed away there as well. Okay, and then, I think this is a very telling slide, but when you are in a camp, you become non-human. I mean, first of all, nobody calls you by your name, unless it's your parents, the soldiers, the people who took care of us, I mean, the Nazis, they only call you a Schwein or ein Hund, you're a dog or you're a pig. I was never thought of as a little girl or Marion. So you become so dehumanized. We learned to count by counting dead bodies. They were as kind of as common as this pew or things, glass. They were just there. We didn't even know that they were really, of course we knew that they were human beings, but that was kind of our world. That was the world we lived in. I think you see that those prisoners in the front having lunch or eating something when, there are thousands of bodies in the back, and they don't even notice that. And this is Bergen-Belsen. Now, what happened to Bergen-Belsen when it became unsustainable? When we were in Bergen-Belsen, it was supposed to hold 10,000 people, and that, of course, it was still livable to some degree. By the time it was liberated, it had 60,000 people. And so it was just a place where everyone was near death or actually at the end of their lives because of typhus, famine, every horrible thing. And you could, okay, someone is keeping time, which is good. So we came to America on the Queen Elizabeth. I always thought that I was on Queen Elizabeth like a princess, and my twin brother always said, just remember that you were third class. You were kind of at the lowest level, but the food we were able to eat, kind of showers and towels and sheets, it was like a fairy tale. And so this was my wonderful mother after the war, standing in a place where a little house was being built in Queens, New York. So this is a precious object that I have in my living room. It was given to my father by my mother on the first birthday he had when we were back in Holland. And he was a smoker, sadly, but it says, Von Abend worden wir nicht gehaald, which means this evening nobody will get us, nobody will pick us up. And so that ashtray is a precious object in my apartment. Okay, and then quickly, when we came to America, we were 9 years old, we had never gone to school. And so we were celebrated as, these twins who survived the Holocaust. So we were 9 years old, but still not going to school because we were kind of pulled out almost every day to visit with some celebrity. And at that time, I said something to my mother, which I think about a lot, because I told my mother, we're 9 years old, we're so much older than anyone else in our class, and yet we're so rarely in school. And my mother said, well, because you are Holocaust survivors and people want to do wonderful things for you and want to honor you. And I said to my mother, and it was kind of very telling response that I gave, I said, Mom, I don't want only to be known as a Holocaust survivor. I want to be known as an American girl. And that was always a conflict I had. This was such a gift to come to America, and my parents felt that it was a dream come true. And they always talked about how you can contribute to America rather than to look and bemoan your fate, and always to be focused on that tragic chapter. It doesn't mean that you forget. I mean, there's not a day, I can tell you, when I don't reflect what happened to us, and the luck and the joy and really the burden of being a survivor. Why should I have been a survivor? I mean, there was 9 million people. So I feel I always feel so humble. How can I represent them? And it's something which still haunts me, I must say, every time I talk about my experience. So this was our first car, a Pontiac in America. And that was, of course, a luncheon with Eleanor Roosevelt, where we were kind of making things to contribute for other refugees. We were asked to knit things for them. And that's it there. Okay. So this was our graduation from Columbia. My brother went into the Navy. And this was the picture that was in almost every newspaper in 1960. And this is a more recent picture. And this is a blanket that survived the Holocaust. It's something that we brought with us from Holland, and it's something that stayed with us to this very day. Well, thank you very much. I've taken too much of your time.